Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something pretty major happening in luxury fashion and maybe even culture itself.
Yeah, it's the appointment of Jonathan Anderson at Dior. He's taking over as creative director for women's, men's, and haute couture.
Which is huge. And we're digging into this using a really insightful article by Mark Abergel. He's a luxury executive based over in Paris.
Right, and Abergel's take is fascinating. He argues this isn't just, another designer shuffle. It's much more strategic.
He sees it as a massive opportunity, really, for Dior, obviously, but also for the parent company, LVMH.
Mm-hmm. An opportunity to step back from just chasing online buzz and really rebuild desirability.
By becoming powerful storytellers again, cultural architects almost. That's Abergel's core idea.
Exactly. Reclaiming their own narrative, especially now with everything going digital. So that's our plan for this deep dive. Unpack Abergel's view.
Okay, so why is this move so significant? Why Anderson? What are the challenges luxury is facing that make this timing so critical?
And what's this bold blueprint Abergel is actually proposing for Dior's future? He thinks they could become a defining cultural force for the next century.
Right, let's get into it. First off, that role Anderson is taking on,
Yeah.
it's just enormous, isn't it? Women's, men's, haute couture, all under one vision.
It really is. And Abergel makes a key point here, unifying all three like this. It hasn't happened since Monsieur Dior himself.
Wow, since the very beginning.
Yeah. That's why Abergel calls it a generational moment. It feels like it's circling back to the foundations of the house, potentially.
Okay, that context is important. And Jonathan Anderson himself, his background, Abergel clearly sees him as uniquely suited for this.
Definitely. His work at Loewe gets mentioned, obviously. The transformation there was, well, widely acclaimed.
Abergel uses the term auteur's eye to describe him. What does that mean in this context?
It's about seeing beyond just clothes. It's blurring boundaries,
Yeah.
between the craft itself and the concept behind it, but also mixing fashion with film, with art.
He thinks cinematically, apparently.
Mm.
Abergel mentions his shows are like screenplays.
Yeah, building an atmosphere, casting characters through the clothes. The designs tell a story about who the person wearing them is, or could be.
And then there was that move signing with UTA, United Talent Agency. That felt different.
Very different. Abergel highlights that. Signing with a big Hollywood agency. It makes it official, as he says. Anderson is not merely a designer, he is a storyteller.
A cinematic move, Abergel called it.
Exactly. It frames him as this multidisciplinary auteur, someone ready for a world where luxury isn't just about the product, but the story, the narrative capital, the cultural weight it carries.
But this big move is happening against a backdrop where, according to Abergel, the luxury industry is actually struggling a bit.
Yeah, he argues its authority, its power to create desire, is under siege. That's his phrase.
Under siege from what or who?
Primarily, he points the finger at big tech platforms, the algorithms, the endless scroll. He thinks they're fundamentally rewriting the whole idea of desirability.
And we're seeing signs of this in the financials, aren't we?
We are. Abergel mentions recent results from LVMH, Kering, Chanel. They're all signaling deceleration.
I remember LVMH even briefly lost its top spot to Hermes as the most valuable luxury stock.
Right, after a sales miss. The general outlook hasn't been overly optimistic for European luxury. Growth is under threat, as Abergel puts it.
So in that kind of climate, just shouting louder online or putting on bigger shows, that's not the answer.
Abergel argues it's actually part of the problem. He says luxury has traded narrative for noise, chasing virality on platforms designed for mass scale, not nuance.
And the result?
Desirability fades. The aura, that specialness that defines luxury, it just evaporates. Too much visibility, he says, not enough intention.
Okay, so with that context, the industry feeling pressured, maybe losing its storytelling mojo, Anderson coming in suddenly feels very strategic, not just symbolic.
Precisely. Abergel emphasizes it's more than symbolic, it's strategic. And he notes Bernard Arnault himself called Anderson one of the greatest creative talents, a crucial asset for Dior's next chapter.
And Delphine Arnault, the CEO, she even drew those parallels between Anderson and Monsieur Dior himself. Their shared interest in art, gardening.
Yeah, hinting at a deeper connection, almost like tapping back into the source code of the brand.
Which leads us nicely to Dior's own history, right? Abergel really leans into this. Christian Dior's new look back in '47.
It wasn't just a new dress shape, was it?
No, it was massive. A total cultural reset after the war. Abigail calls it a cultural earthquake.
Yeah, a symbolic shift. Monsieur Dior wasn't just making clothes. Abigail says he rewrote the zeitgeist. He got that fashion was about emotion, building worlds of desire.
His salons were stages, the models were muses cast into stories.
Exactly. Dior was a medium, collections were broadcasts, he offered aspiration. Abigail really paints a picture of those early shows as being incredibly theatrical, almost cinematic in their approach, cultural storytelling before we even called it that.
So the argument is, Dior was born a cultural institution, and Anderson, perhaps uniquely, can speak that original language again.
That's the core of it. The mission isn't just to reinvent Dior for TikTok, it's a return to that power to author the next cultural era.
Which brings us to Abigail's big idea. Dior, with Anderson, could become the cultural powerhouse of the next century. That's a bold statement.
It is. And he's clear. The issue isn't getting seen. Brands get seen all the time online. The issue is the lack of real desirability, the fading aura.
Because they gave up authorship.
That's his argument. They surrendered it to platforms built for mass attention, not meticulous intention. He contrasts this sharply with Hermes.
Right. What does he say about Hermes?
He argues they kept their sovereignty because they didn't chase the algorithms. They built desire through resonance, something deeper than just fleeting attention.
Resonance scales. Aura compounds. Intention outlasts impression. That's his line, isn't it?
That's the one. It really captures the difference.
So for Dior, the real question isn't about clicks or likes. It's bigger.
Much bigger. Abigail asks, how does Dior shape the next century of culture? And his answer is, it needs cultural architecture, not just more content.
Okay, cultural architecture. This leads to his really quite radical proposal for LVMH as a whole, right?
Yeah, it's pretty fundamental. He says LVMH needs to reclaim absolute control over desirability.
What does that mean in practice? Aesthetic sovereignty? Narrative authority?
Mm-hmm.
What's he getting at?
It's about owning the whole picture,
Yeah.
not letting platforms dictate how your brand is seen or experienced. It's about building your own controlled environment, your own context.
Taking back control.
Completely. Rebuilding LVMH's own cultural infrastructure. He talks about creating a space of aura, even a digital maison.
A digital maison, like an online equivalent of their flagship stores.
Sort of, but more profound. A place where luxury becomes culture-shaping cinema, where the storytelling is the experience, where the heritage feels alive, not just like a museum piece.
And Anderson is the guy to build this. Why him specifically?
Abigail thinks he's already fluent in this new language. He gets cinema, he gets visual storytelling, he gets meaning over noise.
His costume design work seems important here. Challengers, queer.
Definitely. Abigail points to that work as evidence. It's storytelling in fabric. The clothes aren't just costumes. They sculpt the characters, tell you who they are.
Anderson himself talks about being obsessed by cinema, right? As an imitation of life.
Yeah, and about collaboration. That cross-disciplinary approach is key. Abigail sees that UTA signing as a declaration, fashion, film, narrative. It's all intertwined for Anderson.
So he embodies this new idea of a creative director as a cultural architect.
Exactly, working across different media, different canvases.
And Abigail sees him potentially working alongside another major creative force at LVMH.
Yes, he brings Pharrell Williams into the picture, the artistic director at Louis Vuitton Men's. He sees them forming a kind of creative axis.
Both are obviously multi-talented, working across different fields.
Right. Pharrell's background in music, film scores like Hidden Figures, voice acting. Abigail even mentions Pharrell at the Met Gala, talking about style as self-expression and freedom. That resonates with the spirit Dior needs to recapture.
So the potential Abigail sees with these two is, what, a kind of creative engine for LVMH?
A cultural cabinet of luxury, he calls it. Imagine them launching stories, cinematic, cultural projects, turning these fashion houses into a narrative engine of global imagination.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is, but Abigail connects it back to Bernard Arnault talking about that extraordinary power of attraction being the group's long-term guide. Now, maybe that power rests with these directors who think beyond just products.
Okay, so let's get practical. What does this cultural architecture look like? Abigail lays out a kind of blueprint, doesn't he?
He does. 4 main points for Dior to really own its stage, create this sovereign cultural environment.
What's the first one?
Long-form storytelling. Collaborate with the actual film directors, auteurs. Think bigger than just ads. He paints this picture of, say, an original film set at 30 Avenue Montaigne, something mythic, atmospheric, slow.
Moving beyond the standard fashion film format. Got it. Number 2.
Cinema as runway. Create actual narrative series, maybe short films, anthologies. The key is the collections become characters within these stories. The clothes are storied, they have a life in the narrative.
Okay, giving the garments themselves a narrative role. Third,
Digital intimacy. This is about moving away from chasing likes on mainstream platforms. Instead, build Dior's own digital spaces. Think exclusive editorial content, masterclasses, virtual salons, designed for the true believers.
right, replacing endless scrolling with something more engaging, participatory reverence, he calls it.
Exactly. And the fourth point is maybe the most conceptual. Narrative capital as an asset class.
Okay, what does that mean?
Positioning Dior not just as a seller of expensive things, but as a custodian of cultural memory. He even calls it potentially the Louvre of couture, thinking of the Maison itself as a cultural institution, a house of imagination.
And he gives examples of what that might look like.
Yeah, to make it concrete, he throws out ideas like The Seamstress of Montaigne, maybe a historical drama series, or The Thread, a docuseries about the ateliers, Dior Archives Live, using their amazing historical footage, or Une Robe, Une Vie, an anthology where each episode tells the story behind a single iconic dress.
Those examples really drive home his point. Content is not marketing, it's memory.
Exactly. And that memory, that depth, that's what builds aura. That's what builds true desirability. That's the true currency, Abergil argues.
And Anderson himself seems to understand this need to connect history to the present, right? Not just nostalgia.
Yes, Abergil quotes him on that, finding the contemporariness, linking to social iconography, making history relevant now. That seems crucial for reclaiming the cultural future Abergil envisions.
So Abigail sees this as a perfect storm, almost. Hollywood changing, tech platforms maybe losing some grip, LVMH having the talent.
Yeah, he suggests the stars are aligned, there's a cultural vacuum, and maybe luxury, led by figures like Anderson, can step in.
But it requires a real commitment. Build real cultural infrastructure, not just a flashy campaign.
Absolutely. His final thought really lands the scale of this. He says Dior isn't just a brand with a new designer. It's like a civilization facing a potential renaissance.
And Anderson's arrival is the cultural ignition.
Right. The big question isn't just about fashion trends. It's how Dior and Anderson might actually shape what comes next for culture itself.
So, wrapping up Mark Abergill's perspective here, Jonathan Anderson landing at Dior isn't just news, it's a strategic pivot point. An opportunity for Dior and LVMH to stop chasing digital ghosts and become genuine cultural storytellers again.
It's about reclaiming that cultural sovereignty, building desirability through deep stories and real resonance, not just fleeting visibility. That's how they counter the algorithmic noise, in his view.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Of what creates real value or desire for you personally. Is it seeing something everywhere, constantly? Or is it the pull of a compelling story, a sense of depth, maybe even a little mystery?
Yeah, and here's a final thought, building on Abergil's idea. If these huge, established luxury houses like Dior are being told they need to become cultural architects, focused on storytelling, just to stay relevant and desirable in the digital age, what does that imply for everyone else, for value creation in potentially any field? Can that kind of authenticity and narrative depth really hold its own against the sheer scale of the big tech platforms long term? It's a huge question.